World War I is an interesting conflict to study. One of the primary things that always stood out to me was the juxtaposition of technology, with massive armored trains often firing at artillery batteries that had been pulled into battle by horses. Another thing I was struck by during my research was the multiple supernatural stories surrounding Mons. We'll get there eventually. Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'll be covering the most obscure parts of the World War I iceberg. This video series will cover some popular icebergs, focusing more on the highlights than the entirety of the iceberg. I've chosen to go straight into the lower tiers, as they are full of interesting material. Let's begin. Hey everyone, your participation has enabled me to get materials that have helped greatly with video production, and stuff for future videos. If you want to support me further, there's a link to the new Patreon and a place where you can directly contribute in the description below. A Bible shielded a man. Leonard Knight was a 17-year-old British soldier. In 1915, he received a gift from his aunt. She gifted him a hardcover pocket Bible. I couldn't find much information on the details surrounding the incident, but the pocket Bible stopped a German bullet while Knight was stationed in the front lines of the Western Theater. It had lodged a few pages away from the back of the book. Knight went on to survive the war, with the Bible becoming a family heirloom. Knight wasn't the only person to be saved from a bullet by a book or a manuscript, but his story was still compelling. The soldier who let Hitler go. Henry Taddely was well known as a great hero of the Great War, and by war's end had become one of the most highly decorated soldiers who had been on the side of the Commonwealth. He earned a Victoria Cross, the highest accolade given to members of the Commonwealth Armed Forces. However, another event would overshadow his excellent military record. In 1938, Hitler was at a retreat with Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister at the time. They were at Berghof, located within Bavaria. Chamberlain noticed a picture on the wall of the German dictator's study. It was a painting of the Menin Crossroads battle, which took place in 1914. The soldier in the foreground was Henry Taddely. He was carrying a wounded soldier to a place where he could receive medical attention. Hitler pointed the image out and went on to elaborate that while wounded, he had entered the line of fire of a British soldier he said was Taddely. Taddely saw that the man he was aiming at was wounded and allowed him to go peaceably. While Taddely said he would be unwilling to shoot a wounded fleeing enemy, the viability of the encounter still remains contested. Hitler was said to be returning on leave on the day the encounter happened, September 28, 1918, placing him at least 50 miles from where Taddely's unit was stationed. Who shot the Red Baron? Manfred von Richthofen, called the Red Baron, died in the Somme Valley in April 1918. Richthofen was last seen pursuing a Canadian pilot along the valley. An Australian regiment stationed to the east of a village called Corby fired on him, and his plane banked hard and crashed near the road leading towards the village. A Canadian pilot named Roy Brown, who was on the Red Baron's tail at the time, was accredited with the death of the German ace. However, the Australians claimed the kill. Leslie Beavis, an officer attached to the 14th Field Artillery, said that two of his gunners, Bowie and Evans, hit the plane with AA fire, and said that the second Canadian plane was well over 6,000 feet away from the Red Baron at the time. While it remains contested, it seems most likely that the gunners hit the Red Baron and took him out. The Angel of Mons. Allied soldiers recorded several encounters with supernatural beings during the Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914. The Battle of the Frontiers ended in an Allied retreat from the advancing German forces. Many retreating soldiers told stories of seeing ghostly bowmen, led by a towering figure riding a blindingly bright horse, cover their retreat. Scriptural figures such as the Virgin Mary and Saint Michael made an appearance as well. A unit of British Coldstream Guards, the last unit to withdraw, claimed that an angel helped them find their way back to the safety of the Allied lines. Unfortunately, few of these soldiers were able to give further details of the battle, as many of these regular troops would pass away by the end of the war. Trench rats. These creatures were a massive issue throughout the war, with the rats rapidly multiplying thanks to their access to plentiful scraps of food and the dead. Some soldiers recorded seeing rats the size of adult cats, which, if you can imagine, with the size of the average cat, would be around 1.5 feet long. Groups of rats were often capable of taking out a wounded soldier. Mercy Dog. These dogs were deployed to search for wounded soldiers after battles. Many carried medical supplies on their backs and even wore gas masks. Their job was to find wounded men and then pick up a piece of their uniform in their teeth, remove it, and run back with it to their camp. This idea was popularized in 1890 by the German painter and dog lover Jean Bergartz. He founded the German Association for Medical Dogs with the purpose of training dogs to locate the wounded. In 1895, Major Edwin Richardson, a British officer, took notice of a foreigner buying an English sheepdog to bring back to Germany. Richardson talked to the man and learned that the German army was buying large quantities of dogs. Richardson loved dogs and began to test their usefulness in a future conflict. He went to the Barry Budden training camp in Scotland and started to experiment with different breeds. He fastened them with saddlebags and sent them to deliver alcohol to presumably happy army volunteers. Collies were good for the job, but Airedale Terriers were best suited for what he wanted to accomplish. Richardson opened the British War Dog School in 1914 and began work, regularly acclimating the dogs to the sounds of artillery and gunfire. Richardson hired locals to lie in scattered locations throughout the woods near the camp, and taught the dogs to locate people and bring medics to their positions. He taught them to pass dead bodies and even ignore those wearing German uniforms. By the beginning of the war, mercy dogs from Germany, France, and Britain joined the war effort. An estimated 50,000 dogs would serve the three countries during the war. The dogs helped save many injured men and provided companionship to the fatally wounded. One doctor wrote about how the dogs often helped save men who had been thought dead. They sometimes lead us to the bodies we think have no life in them, but when we bring them back to the doctors, they always find a spark. It is purely a matter of their instinct, which is far more effective than man's reasoning powers. Interestingly, the original Rin Tin Tin was bred to be a mercy dog. Passchendaele Mud Drownings. Also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, this conflict centered around a vital agricultural city in Belgium. The British had destroyed the nearby Messines Ridge on the morning of June 7th, detonating over 7 million tons of TNT in an explosion that was heard as far away as London, which was over 200 miles distant. The Germans withdrew after this terrific explosion, falling back and constructing a series of fortifications closer to the city. The British waited 7 weeks and consolidated their forces to prepare to push back the Germans even further. A massive artillery bombardment on the German positions ensued, and the no man's land between the Allies and the Central Powers became a cratered wasteland. However, the planned British ground offensive was stymied by a week of non-stop rain. The rain rapidly filled the shell holes, and the land, which was below sea level and close to the coast, began to flood. This event would delineate the battle for the region from others before it, as thousands of British troops would drown in the mud, attempting to rush the German positions. 88,000 Allied troops from the Commonwealth would lose their lives, with the majority of those casualties resulting from the mud. It's said that Belgian farmers still uncover human skeletons in their fields to this day. The Lost Battalion. The Lost Battalion was a collection of several different companies belonging to the 77th Division of the American Forces. It was October 1918. The 100 Days Offensive, a campaign that aimed to break through the Siegfried Line and hopefully end the war, was well underway. The battalion, led by a man named Major Whittlesey, had been given the order to enter the Argonne Forest and capture a target called Hill 198. They quickly encountered light resistance and were confident that they and the other battalions around them could get to their objective. However, unbeknownst to the battalion, the units on their flanks were still fighting their way through the front lines of the German positions. Their battalion was now deep in enemy territory. They reached and captured the hill, but a massive German offensive passed by them and pushed back the American and supporting French forces. Whittlesey quickly understood that they were now encircled. He chose to hold their ground and keep the hill instead of retreat. They held on for 5 whole days and nights. In the end, their own forces did them in. An American barrage aiming at the German positions landed on the Lost Battalion. None of the battalion's carrier pigeons had been able to reach the American lines to tell them to stop. The battalion released their last carrier pigeon, Cher Ami, carrying their location and a plea to stop firing on them. Cher Ami suffered multiple injuries during the flight, but was able to make it to the American lines before succumbing to her wounds. The Germans released a captured American prisoner to deliver a message to the battalion in the interim. The message read, paraphrase, "We have heard the cries of your wounded men. Why don't you just give up and surrender?" Whittlesey simply said nothing to the message, treating the offer with contempt. The Germans mounted one final assault, but failed to take out the remaining soldiers. The American 82nd Division soon arrived on the scene, and the starving soldiers in the battalion were given food, and the wounded cared for. Germany helped Lenin. Germany actively encouraged the Russian Revolution, as they wanted to destabilize Russia so that they could focus on other fronts. Germany chartered a train in 1917 and filled it with 32 Russian émigrés that were in exile, most notably Lenin. The train took them from Switzerland through Germany, where they took a ship to Sweden, then crossed into Russian territory through the Finnish border. Nurse Margret Maule. This nurse's story remained unknown up until 2013, when researchers found a battered suitcase in the back of a cupboard at the University of Abertay. It contained photographs, letters from German and English soldiers, and a diary, along with other mementos from Maule's life. Maule worked on the staff of a hospital in Kent, and treated both English soldiers and German prisoners of war. Maule had lost a brother in the war, and her diaries revealed her many misgivings about her assignment to the hospital. Nevertheless, she was an exemplary nurse, with grateful soldiers from both sides sending her thank you notes. The means by which the suitcase reached the cupboard within a university still remains unknown. The Crucified Soldier. This story began in 1915. It was said that a Canadian soldier had been crucified by German troops during the Second Battle of Ypres. The story was first seen in a newspaper interview featured in the Morning Post. An unnamed lieutenant colonel had written in, claiming that the members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were furious with the Germans after they found one of their troops crucified. The story was picked up a few days later by the Times and garnered even more publicity with a report later being fielded in the House of Commons. The details of the story and its origin remain undefined, with reports of the man's rank, number of men that were crucified, and regiment constantly changing. The story later became an American propaganda poster that was placed in the Philippines. The poster quickly stirred up fear in the Allied civilian populations and was redistributed throughout the US, along with a follow-up propaganda film called The Prussian Cur, now lost to time, which featured a scene in which this purported atrocity occurred. Mystery of Celtic Wood. It was October 1917. An 85-man team of Australian troops left friendly lines to go and conduct a raid. The men entered Celtic Wood, near a small town in Belgium, and many were never seen alive again. Just 14 men made it back to their lines. The Australians had tried previous raids, and the Germans were onto them. A German ambush had been prepared in the woods, and many of the men had lost their lives. Their bodies were never recovered, as the woods were demolished by shell fire from both the British and German forces. Walt Disney's newspaper. Walt Disney wanted to go to war. His older brother had shipped out to help the war effort. Walt was 16, with the required age for enlistment being 17. Walt ended up faking his age and joined the Ambulance Corps. The name of this entry refers to the letter he sent to his high school newspaper while he was overseas. Corporal Jackie. Jackie was a Chacma baboon that served as the regimental mascot for the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment. He was the pet of Albert Marr, a young man who had found the monkey wandering around his family farm and had elected to keep and train him. Marr was later drafted in 1915. He was heartbroken at the strong possibility that he would have to leave Jackie behind, and asked the recruiter if he could bring him. They said yes, and Jackie was drafted as well. Jackie was given a uniform, a paybook, and his own rations. Jackie was so well trained that he could stand at attention while properly saluting officers, and often acted as a sentry for the group. Jackie went to the trenches with the regiment, was observed building structures to protect himself from enemy fire. At one point, a piece of shrapnel hit his right leg while he was building, and the baboon was sent to the regimental doctors. The doctors realized that they would have to amputate Jackie, and decided to put him under with chloroform, despite the fact that they were completely unaware what the drug would do to him. Jackie survived and won a medal for his bravery, and was promoted to corporal. He was loved by the unit, and Marr and Jackie survived the war. Jackie received a full military pension after he left the army. Attack of the Dead Men. I'll open this entry with an account from a book titled The Defense of the Fortress, Auschwitz. It was written by one of the survivors of the battle. I couldn't find the name of the author, but I will place a link to the original post where I found the story in the description. This event occurred in 1915 and opened with a German gas attack on a Russian fortress located in present-day Poland. At 4 a.m. on the 24th of July, the gas was released. It was of a dark green color. The exact recipe of it, having chlorine in its base, was hard to determine. It was later found to be a mixture of chlorine and bromine that turned the air into hydrochloric acid. However, there was undoubtedly some other addition that intensified the choking effect. The dense cloud of gas reached our trenches after only 5 to 10 minutes. It was heading towards the fortress fast, having a high starting speed and expanding to the sides and up. Despite the measures taken, such as burning tow and hay in front of the trenches, pouring and spraying lime, and wearing respirators, almost all the defenders of the 1st, the 2nd, the soldiers, were poisoned by the choking gas to death. Along with the lethal assault on our front troops, the poison of the gas also overwhelmed the majority of the defenders of the fortress, getting into even tightly closed rooms. The garrison took all of the recommended measures against the gas, but it turned out that the anti-gas masks available at the time only helped against the gas very little, due to the small size of their neutralizing area, and possibly due to the fact that using them in combat was incredibly difficult, as it was hard to tie them on and keep them fitted, tight to the skin. It was especially a challenge for the officers who, commanding the soldiers, had to take the masks off or lift them up temporarily to issue orders. The strength of the gas was partly diminished by the conditions of the climate and local geography. The morning of the 24th was cold, foggy, and damp, and after having passed over the wet marshes, the river, and the moats, the gas was considerably weakened, which saved our garrison from enormous losses. After the release of the gas, the enemy instantly sent up red flares everywhere, signaling that the gas had been released and the movement of the troops for frontal assault could now begin. The Russian fortress had repeatedly resisted, so this form of attack was authorized by the German commanders. The gas targeted the faces of the men and killed all the creatures and plant life around the fortress. The Germans advanced, confident that they would meet little resistance. Russian reinforcements emerged to help the roughly 100 survivors left in the front trenches. The survivors affixed bayonets and began to crawl and limp their way out of their positions. The Germans were met by men that looked like the living dead, who were croaking and gasping, with their faces half hidden by bloody rags. This significantly freaked the Germans out, and they withdrew back to their own lines. The fortress would continue to remain under Russian control for several weeks. Who killed John Parr? John Parr was a 17-year-old soldier who was last seen in August 1914, before the Battle of Mons. He became the first British soldier to die in action in Europe. He was a reconnaissance cyclist trained to go ahead of the main force to collect information for his commanders. His death would remain unrecorded in the midst of the chaos of the opening months of the war, and his parents would remain unaware of his fate until a year later in August 1915. Parr was last seen scouting ahead of the British, where it is believed that he ran into a group of German cavalry and was killed. However, a historian named Andy Robertshaw has said that he believes that Parr was killed by friendly fire, either from the Belgian forces or a French cavalry patrol. According to Robertshaw, Parr was not in a position to encounter enemy forces and most likely was taken out by his allies. Nearly 110 years later, the first British death in combat still remains unsolved. Kinmel Park Riot. Occurring on the days of March 4th and 5th of 1919, Canadian troops in Wales rebelled as they were stuck in a camp waiting to go home. The lack of labor to operate ships that could transport troops home meant that the men were stuck in a camp in the midst of an unusually ferocious winter in Britain. Food and coal were scarce, and the Spanish flu was affecting the country. The troops had been broken into smaller wings within the camp, designated by what Canadian district they came from, instead of being grouped by regiment. Enlisted personnel were stuck with unfamiliar officers, and a feeling of alienation began to envelop many within the wings. A riot erupted as the troops raided canteens and quartermaster stores for food. The camp commandant ordered all of the ammunition to be collected and placed in a secure location. He then ordered 2 pounds to be given to each soldier. In addition, he established a cordon within the camp, and had a group of 40 officers and trustworthy enlisted men manned the barricade. The officers clashed with the rioters and seized 20 of the rioters despite resistance. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out, and gunfire erupted from the clashing groups. The rioters surrendered after 3 of their group were mortally wounded, with the guards losing 2 men. 23 men were wounded from both sides. In the end, 25 soldiers were convicted under the British Army Act and sentenced to various terms ranging from 90 days to 10 years. The crew of the Sebrina. The Sebrina was a 3-masted rigged barge designed to operate in rivers. She was later pressed into service and regularly moved supplies between the UK and the continent. In the fall of 1917, she left Falmouth with coal, but failed to reach her destination in France. The Sebrina was found 3 days after her departure. She had run aground and bore no visible damage outside of some disorderly rigging. Her crew complement of 5 was completely missing. All of the lifeboats were still attached to the craft, and the ship's log bore no reports of an accident. The events that led to the crew disappearing still remain unknown. The scuttling of the German fleet. The German Navy's U-boats were confiscated after the end of the war, on November 11th, 1918. However, the Allies were unsure what to do with the surface ships of the German fleet. A 191-ship Allied convoy met with the 70-ship-strong German fleet on the 21st of November, 1918. This combined fleet sailed into the Firth of Forth in Scotland and became the largest fleet of warships ever assembled. Final checks were made to ensure that the German ships were disarmed, and then the fleet sailed to Scapa Flow. 4 more German ships arrived to enter Scapa Flow. The German admiral then sent most of his men home, with over 20,000 sailors leaving the fleet. The skeleton crew was left behind to take care of the ships, while the Allies tried to figure out what to do. The men who were left behind were given no supplies or ways to entertain themselves, and the discipline and morale of the fleet began to further fall. The men grew so disorderly that the commander of the fleet elected to leave his own flagship to move to a smaller cruiser where he felt safe. The sailors fished, and one destroyer crew built a spring-loaded gun with which they killed seabirds for food. The Germans grew so fearful that their ships would be seized, and in the summer of 1919, the ship captains opened everything they could on their ships to ensure that they flooded. 52 of the 74 ships were sunk, and a total of 400,000 tons of material were scuttled within the space of 5 hours. 9 sailors were shot, and 16 injured by the British as the Allies tried to save the ships, marking the final German casualties of the war. Today, 7 of the ships still remain at the bottom of Scapa Flow, where they can be explored today. SM UB-85 Sea Monster. The UB-85 was a submarine that was patrolling the sea in late April 1918. The captain, Gunther Kretsch, had been fruitlessly searching for targets for the past 2 weeks. Kretsch and his officers were in the tower of the submarine scanning the surrounding ocean on the night of April 30th. The moon was fully up, giving him an opportunity to easily spot targets. The submarine was suddenly rocked by a surge of ocean water, and the right side of the craft rang as something impacted with the hull. Kretsch saw a massive horned skull with 2 deep-set eyes lift its head level with the submarine, and it began to stare at him. The men on watch began to fire at it with their sidearms. It clambered onto the forward gun mount and began to drag the submarine down into the water. Kretsch and his men continued to fire at the beast, and it eventually slipped back under the waves. The front of the submarine was heavily damaged by the attack, preventing the crew from submerging, and a British cutter soon arrived at the UB-85 and captured the sailors. Bertha Trost. Bertha Trost was a German émigré who relocated to London in 1895. She ran a beauty salon in an antiquarian shop, and was known for wearing Victorian-era clothes. She regularly hosted parties at her home and invited important figures within the underground British art community. Her living room was furnished with a rosewood coffin that she had designed for when she eventually passed away. Trost was later exported in 1915 after it was discovered that she had been part of a German spy ring. The artist, J.M. This refers to a pair of bound sketchbooks, collecting drawings made by a British soldier, with the initials J.M. J.M. used stationery that bore the insignia of the Royal Regiment of Artillery and was based in France and Belgium from 1917 to 1918. One of the books opens with a dedication to his daughter Adele. These books were first discovered in the University of Vancouver in the 1960s. The images are striking and contain portraits and sketches about life near the front lines of the war. One of the more haunting sketches, at least in my opinion, is this ink print that depicts the effects of a chemical attack on the horses belonging to JM's unit. There's an entire archive of these images that can be easily located online if you search the artist JM. German Corpse Factory. This was a propaganda campaign published by the Times and the Daily Mail in 1917. The first article was released by the Times and claimed that the Germans were burning bodies to extract glycerin, an extract useful for creating weapons, lubricant, cellophane, and dyes. The purpose of the story, which was widely distributed within China, was to encourage China to join the war on the side of the Allies. This further encouraged China to declare war on the Central Powers. The story did have some truth to it. Germany was not processing dead soldiers, but did have facilities for processing dead animals to make tallow and grease. Maffia. This was spelled M-A-F-F-I-A, not like the more contemporary name for the mob. The Maffia was a Czech resistance movement that aimed to destabilize Austria-Hungary and reinstate Czech independence. It was active from 1914 to 1918 and had over 300 members during its heyday. The Lost Sandringhams. The company belonged to the 5th Territorial Battalion of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. However, they were very different from most of the companies entering combat during the Dardanelles campaign in 1915. The majority of the company were former staff of the royal estate at Sandringham. They had been enlisted in 1908 at the request of their employer, King Edward VII. The company was led by the gentry who ran the estate, Frank Beck and his 2 young nephews. The non-commissioned officers were former butlers, gardeners, and gamekeepers. The grooms and household servants were the corporals and privates of the unit. The company was part of the brutal Dardanelles campaign in Turkey. Harassed by sniper fire and under attack from the Turkish batteries, E Company joined their battalion, conducted a charge at the enemy artillery, and simply disappeared. It's believed that the unit was overwhelmed and wiped out by the Turkish, as they were very unwilling to take prisoners. Boomerang Grenade. This patented design would have taken a boomerang crafted out of flat galvanized iron and then placed an 85-gram charge of explosive and then a detonator on one end. Its inventor, G.V. Russell, said that it would travel long distances in one direction due to the fact that it would be heavier on one end. His design was rejected, even though he successfully petitioned for multiple tests of the boomerang grenade. British opium cigarettes. This legend surrounds the 1917 Battle for Jerusalem. It's said that the British airdropped opium-laced cigarettes on the invading Ottoman army in an attempt to slow their assault on the city of Jerusalem. No primary accounts online talked about this, so it seems likely that the story was fabricated. Permanent Russian Sentry. This entry also lacked any primary sources, and I found little information when I researched it. It was said that a blind white Russian soldier was discovered in a tunnel complex under a fortress in Poland in 1925, almost a decade after the revolution. Despite the cajoling of his rescuers, he remained at his post, saying he would not leave until either his commanding officer or the Tsar himself told him to stand down. Stab in the back myth. You'll actually see this come up a lot in books about the Germans during World War II. This story was popularized by German nationalists who claimed that the German army did not lose the war on the battlefield, but was in fact done in by socialists, communists, and Jews back in their homeland. The Hound of Mons. The story of the Hound of Mons is relatively popular, and overall makes for a good tale similar to the Island of Dr. Moreau. The first account was published by a Canadian veteran named F.J. Newhouse in 1919. The encounters with the Hound of Mons began during November 14, 1914. Captain Yeskis and 4 men belonging to the London Fusiliers went into no man's land to patrol for enemy saboteurs. They went into the darkness and went missing for several days. Their bodies were found in no man's land by another patrol. The bodies had been disfigured, and teeth marks were present on their throats. Sentries in the British lines heard blood-curdling howls over the next few nights. Over the next 2 years, that section of the front continued to report patrols that were found with the same marks as the London Fusiliers group. Some men on watch claimed to have seen the outline of a huge wolf outside of their perimeter. Eventually, the attack ceased. Newhouse claimed that the creature plaguing Allied patrols near Mons was a German experiment created by placing the brain of a madman inside the body of a Siberian wolfhound. Prince the dog. Prince was an Irish Terrier Collie mix who belonged to Private James Brown of Cork. Brown was a British soldier who joined the military in September 1914. In November, his wife wrote to Brown to tell him that Prince had disappeared. Brown was stationed in northern France at the time when he saw a dog that closely resembled Prince. He called to the dog and was surprised to see that it was, in fact, Prince. The dog had somehow gotten all the way to northern France from the Hammersmith district within London. He became the regimental mascot and hunted rats within their quarters. California's War on Squirrels. California enlisted school children to fight a different kind of war in April 1918. This was part of a campaign called Squirrel Week, a period in which California tried its best to wipe out ground squirrels. Farmers and ranchers have been facing economic losses from the pests, with an estimated $480 million worth of crops being eaten by the ground squirrels each year. The campaign was announced by the state horticultural commissioners in March of that year. The commissioners enjoyed a banquet that served gopher meat sourced from the ground squirrels. Strychnine-laced grain was issued to children, who were then told to place them outside of squirrel burrows. By the end of the week, children had turned in 104,509 squirrel tails as confirmation of their unaliving of the squirrels. The campaign continued for the rest of the year, with a girl in Lassen County bringing 3,780 squirrel tails to a commissioner's office. The Wild Men of No Man's Land. No Man's Land was a terrifying place to the men stationed on the front lines of the war. It was a horrendous place, and legends began to arise around what lurked outside the trenches when the Allies and Central Powers were not attempting to scout or attack their opponents. One story continued to be discussed in many sections of the sweeping war. It was said that a community of deserters, ranging from every nationality, lived in the abandoned trenches and forts present in many parts of No Man's Land. Some stories said that these men would come out at night and scavenge or even take provisions from the dead and dying. Alright, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, definitely check out some of the other stuff I've made. Consider subscribing if you'd like to be notified about when I upload. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee can be found in the description if you want to support me. Until next time, I'll see you around.